Right. Conscious that somebody somewhere else in this building has a conference to run a little later, it seems right to start. I hope you've all had a useful crack at the breakfast that finally made its way here by canoe. I think it's still meat and not fish that we've provided, I hope it has provided you at least a start with the day. And indeed, in thinking while the remarks here are going to be about land, just to express a level of concern about the scale of flooding across the country at the moment and its effects and where we sit after the weather we've had since the end of September. But welcome this to the event of the CAAV, looking at a number of land tenure issues, both ownership and tenancy. In looking at these things, I was asked by somebody coming in, so very courteously coming to visit visitors, saying, well, who are you? And so I thought we should have a slide that said that. Professional association, we've existed as a body fulfilling our functions for the rural economy since 1910, member local associations since at least 1847. And we represent, we brief, we qualify agricultural valuers who do more than agriculture and more than valuation across the whole UK. So we cover England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland in that. And in that we qualify fellows by examination, a rigorous 2-day written, practical and oral examination. Those results went out just before Christmas. And our interest is basically in the mechanics, the engineering, the practicality of rural life. Do all the interactions between policy and tax and tenancy and planning and what people actually want to do and what people might be minded to do and how does it all fit and where do things come unstuck. And so we'll talk with the governments around the UK about, well, if you do it that way, you might succeed and if that's your objective, but actually if that's your objective, you might prefer another way of doing it. But what actually makes things work so the rural economy, the agricultural economy works better, hums better. And I think those would be our central watchwords in all of this. But that's as an association, fundamentally, it is that members can give the best advice to the client in the situation they are in for their circumstances and objectives, help them through the issues and objectives. And so we'd like policy to give clear advice, to be able to give clear advice, but we would like to give clear advice on which people can make decisions to choose whether or not to spend money, whether or not to restructure their business or whatever it is, each being a decision, inertia being a decision. But as I will have expressed indeed last year, we take the view that we are looking at the most fascinating, interesting, challenging, promising decade we have probably known professionally in any of the lives of anybody in this room. And the business of transition, the business of the environment and other issues, climate change coming through, but also, particularly in England, but watch Wales is following, and in their own ways Scotland and Northern Ireland are coming also. People are, in their farm businesses, being asked to look at their businesses. The removal of basic payment, now gone in England as of New Year's Eve, means that people are now looking at their businesses, and then what are the options around those businesses, and we have to be able to give advice. So with that, I hope trying to answer the question that was put to me. We have, hoping we're here, does this work at all? Yes, it should do. Where are we? That's it. That's there. Trying to get on with this. There were land as a basic factor of production. Land is many things for us. It's a store of value. It's a basic factor of production. Indeed, if you go back to the debates about rates relief, in the 1920s, it's like plant and machinery for farming. It's not just where you have a business, it's with which you have a business. And it was also a secure basis, if you look across the whole economy, real estate as an asset, a basis for a free society, a market economy, a source of borrowing. It serves many functions and supporting investment and a good economy, and for all that, issues of secure title and ability to transfer, and those things matter enormously. And it's a very distinctive feature of UK land law, going back century after century, as they say, beyond which the memory of man runneth not to the contrary, that we've been able to cut and dice and slice land and interests in it. The critical feature of UK land law is not looking at land as a whole, but land in parts. And so we can let it, we can split it, we can devise it by will as we please. The tenancy structures that we have are long-standing. The oldest written lease still surviving in anybody's records is a lease of 717 in the next county in Gloucestershire. And actually that lease is a lease with shades of a trust around it, if we wanted to play with that. So, we have ingenuity, we have resources, and we come to look at land ownership. And here, of course, it's a regulatory market. is defined by what society allows. The Englishman's home may be his castle, but as long as the people around respect that, and it's what the ground rules are for that. But it gives recognised title, that excludes others, just as a tenancy in itself as an interest in land excludes the landlord. We have statute law impinging on that in a number of ways, and we'll come on later on, if we have time, to things like planning and compulsory purchase later down the line. And then all the contractual restrictions, you agree. But the owner has freedom of use and action, but within what society wants in terms of law and expectations. And that's where we are now at quite some interesting points. And so this slide is, in a sense, a bit of a recognition of some of the discussions early yesterday morning, looking at things that were going on. We are very well established. The valuers, the lawyers, and so on, in handling property issues have centuries of experience in looking at this. But we are now looking at new issues coming down the tracks at us with environmental issues, and of course people who are consciously coming in as environmental owners. A lot of discussion around the involvement, just make some passing points, because they did seem to arise out of yesterday, around private capital and institutional capital looking at this. And actually, the point I've made periodically to those in DEFRA looking at this is the best capital, most focused on what can be done on a farm, is the owner's own capital. We are listening to the discussions yesterday in this room in the NIAB meeting. It struck me that the answers coming from venture capital just show how unsuited we are at farm scale to so much of this. We're too small. Our transactions costs are too high. The ongoing costs of monitoring and verification and the rest. And the liabilities are too great in all of this. It's the owner's own capital, and agricultural land is the best form of secured lending for the cheapest borrowing that you can find in almost any market. So actually I think we may slightly be watching the wrong point in this. But we are, as I said in my opening remarks, I think seeing economic processes of change underway. Partly because we've spent 30 years of area payments holding change back. And I think that's something really to pick up on, and we look at this. We hear of the current pressure, and a lot of the discussion, and I think there is a mood in farming that is soured by the last few months of the weather as much as anything. The water gets into your soul at that point. But you hear people for whom this is pressure. You don't tend to hear the people who are the thriving businesses of the future. It is always the issue with economic change. When change drives opportunity, is you hear the people it hurts, and you tend not to see the people who build the opportunities for the future. And in looking at all of this, and when we come to look in a moment at tenancies, the critical thing about, again, this division of interests in land is that we're allocating risks between parties. And the business deals that do that are, I think, critical, and we have to be able to look, advise, and get them right. But we're making land more complicated. And if we think of Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver was tied down by small pieces of string by very small people, here we are. I'll give you a couple of slides around this. Planning clearly is an area, and it was called town and country planning, and essentially for some time until probably towards the end of the 80s, it was town planning. It stopped at the settlement edge. It removed the private owner's ability to develop without consent. But actually, of course, in 47, they provided a compensation fund, the unexpended benefit, to compensate for that in those years when that was feasible. The planning system gives value to the people it favours and denies it to people it doesn't. But it's now increasingly in the countryside, and we increasingly have an entrenched culture in large areas of the country, which is just profound resistance to development. And just to summarise this, you will all have heard of the NIMBY, but he has now mutated. This insect has moved on from the chrysalis, is now moved on to being the butterfly of the banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. And we look, quite alarmingly, for a major project for the rural economy at Cuxton Winery down in Kent, 30 million of investment to produce 112 million of economic activity, to found the British Prosecco industry, because climate change destroys the Italian one. The planning officers recommended approval. The population resisted, the committee voted it down, it went to appeal, and you weren't allowed to do it because you were in an AONB. Can't you do this in an industrial estate, they said, not in your own vineyard? You look at that. But we have government planning by twin-forked policy. We set up mechanisms that deny permission, and then we create permitted development rights, as the Secretary of State very welcomely heralded more yesterday in his speech yesterday. We have, between the Class Q type rights in England, and of course there are parallel rights in Scotland, we have, along with the office and commercial rights for conversion, in the last 7 or 8 years, we've converted buildings to 90,000 dwellings without planning permission. We are capable of changing entire town centres now to residential without planning permission. This is a completely remarkable change, and watching how this one runs. But we have more environmental and conservation rules, and this is where I actually want to spend a bit of time for this. You move to trees, it is at the moment a permanent land use change. It's a one-way valve. We have environmental impact assessments and ammonia fouling up people's chances to get their slurry stores. Listed buildings. The challenge of listed buildings and energy efficiency is phenomenal. We spent some time exploring the ways in which you can get an electric vehicle charging point into a listed building. The only place I've seen actually handling this sensibly at the moment is, of course, the deeply rural borough of London Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which has produced a listed building consent order which says this is how you can have solar tiles and panels and heat pumps in your listed buildings. Little irony, of course, is that I think it was one of the major estates there, had 15 properties in Buckingham Palace Road. 14 were cleared under the policy, but the 15th wasn't because it went to a different planner. The ironies that you live with. There are interactions in all that need simplifying. We had a situation on a river that the owner very much wanted to allow to wiggle. The Environment Agency was very happy for it to wiggle. It required going to a planning officer. The poor, overstretched, under-resourced planning officer didn't know what was in front of him. So he sat on it. That's delayed that project by 2 years. National parks and AONBs, more restrictive control. And of course, we now just keep on inventing more national parks. At what point does this process stop? Listed building conservation areas, and then where I want to go really, and partly with the experience of work on Dartmoor over the autumn, where we're looking at these very specific points of environmental control. We've got targets around this, not statutory, but to do an enormous amount of improvement of SSSIs. We've got interim targets, and so I think we want to look at these all just a little bit more. And when you actually explore it, it's a completely chaotic regime. From the outside, you think it's coherent. When you get inside, it isn't. We've been designating SSSIs since 1949. They are of interest. That's all they are. Nobody ever said they're in good condition. Nobody ever said anything else. It's a framework then we developed for agreements as we come through the 60s and then the 80s Wildlife and Countryside Act. On top of that, the European Union then invented the Habitats Directive, its network, its Natura 2000 network of special areas of conservation, introduced the concept of favourable condition, and these two have got interrelated and overlapped in ways that are now quite challenging because we don't really know what favourable condition is. We are now within 26 years of the 2050 target for net zero and climate, trying to balance climate change. Climate change is accelerating very fast. We are 70 and more years from when some of these sites were designated. We're working in a very shifting environment. And then to look at the level of control. I talked about how planning took development. SSSIs have perhaps for many people been quite a light touch regime for the last 70 odd years. But the regime tells you there are things that you need consent to do. And this is now becoming a flashpoint, and in a sense it's Dartmoor, but it's West Penwith and it's other areas. And I just give you that example, and this is a Dartmoor one. The ORNEC, the Operation Requiring Natural England's Consent, says grazing and change in the grazing regime, including type of stock, intensity, seasonal, and indeed cessation of grazing. You know, Gulliver's completely tied down at that point. Any choice strictly needs Natural England's consent. And there is no, unlike that initial introduction of the planning system, there is no compensation. And the dairy farmers in West Penwith are looking at this and saying, well, what we've been doing for a while, and whether or not it's good or bad, whatever it is, they've invested and they built businesses around it, saying, look, we're probably now on a 5-year license for how we've run our properties. Now, that is a very interesting evolution because those targets are now driving these policies, and it's management restriction without compensation. And I think that's something that we need to be increasingly aware of. And beyond this, and outside the scope of almost all the current policies that we have, is the question of 30 by 30. Somebody somewhere in 2019 signed up to this benignly as an international commitment. It's locked into the Kunming, Montreal Protocol and the rest. It means that we are to have 30% of our land managed for nature by 2030, 6 years away. That's well outside any of the ambitions of the environmental land management schemes or anything else. And it may make sense even in a country, never mind the States or Canada or wherever, or Australia, it may make sense even in a country like Germany with its large forests and its mountain areas and so on. So we apply it to England. Managed, modelled, remodelled by farmers for what, 8,000 years? A landscape made by man. The nature is semi-natural, is the kindest you can find for it if you wish to look at it that. We have about 8% of England under some form of SSSI, etc. So that's 22%. That looks like 6.2 million acres to find for this. It was cited in the West Penwith extension. And we've now had paper, not just from Scotland that came out last May, but we have a paper in England now on this, and it's setting and very much building on where we were with the Nature Recovery Green Paper of a couple of years ago. Its purpose, the land is to have a purpose for conserving biodiversity. It's got to have a long-term commitment. Now, this can be public or private, probably, or one way or another of dealing with it, and it's got to have outcomes defined for achievement to qualify for this. That is quite a big thing hanging over us. It doesn't exclude you from farming on that land. Indeed, many SSIs are farmed. But it is a very interesting set of statements about what society is beginning to expect, and this is under international commitments. And I think this is something we do need to watch as we go through. And then a passing word, just simply on the language we're using. We're doing an awful lot. It's a classic English trope. We recover a golden age. We hark back to when things were good. We will restore things. Recovery of nature, well, what are we trying to recover? Particularly at a time when the underlying environment is moving so fast, with particularly climate change, but other pressures as well. And I think we do have to have an honest conversation, a good practical conversation, a conversation for which we are lacking a lot of data, an understanding of many sites and the broader position, about what is a good nature for England on this 30% or smaller areas or SSIs or whatever you want. What is the good nature that we should be working towards for 2050, rather than trying to recover places that weren't in good condition in 1949, with so much that has changed since then. So let's look a little bit about tenancies. We covered ownership. There's more, if we have time, to come around compensation and agricultural and various other matters. But choosing a future. And I think this is where, again, using the theme I set on the opening title of looking at Crossroads. And it's, again, that business of do we protect the past or do we look to be open to the future? And there are balances in all these things, but it perhaps helps to put it this way. What is needed more and what are the costs? And government, I think, has got a broader-minded response to this than came through in the Rock Review. The government response broadly boiled down to two propositions. It wants a diverse let sector with differing lengths of tenancy. It sees landlord-tenant as a business contract, but it wants people to behave well in good relationships. It wants mutual advantage where it can be found. And those twin themes of flexibility and good business behaviour, I think, are perfectly valid watchwords for where we're looking. Deviating very far from them, and I think we get ourselves into trouble. And going right back again to my opening slide, looking at the question of repeating old mistakes, and I could point to where we're doing that as well in the residential sector. There are people in this room who will remember where we were in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when the combination of high capital taxation and everything being let within the Holdings Act to which succession had just been applied, meant that everybody looked for every which way not to use the Holdings Act. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But we're looking now at much structural change coming in this fascinating decade. Support is forgotten. Businesses will change. It's that process of change we have to manage well. A flexible sector will manage that better. But we equally have to find the opportunities for those who will feel that they should be withdrawing from farming. So the case for tenancies, because it isn't necessarily open and shut, but I'm a strong advocate of the agricultural tenancy system. I mean, it kept me quite entertained and occupied for a very long time, as it will have done Julie. But landlord, there are very many reasons for owning land that by no means always include being a farmer. Nothing requires a landowner to be a good farmer. The landowner's grandfather can be a terribly good farmer, and the grandson might not be. but they still want and need and wish to own the land. Having arrangements whereby other people can do that for them and pay them a good rent, quite possibly better than they would earn by farming badly, is a good idea. And again, it's this business of allocating risk. There's an owner holding a debenture risk being rewarded by a rent, the tenant taking business risk being rewarded, the equity risk in this. You can farm independently without owning land. Why, of all businesses, is farming the business where you would expect people to tie working capital up in land with its desperately low return? Now, most other businesses operate on rented property, but where the capital value is linked more securely to the rental value. If you're a good businessman, deploy the capital in your business, not in premises. Equally, again, a good balance between the two gives you the collateral value and the like. But these are insights into all of this. But a clean separation in risk, in time horizon, in responsibility, all of this, and the tenant's independence. It's cleaner to administer than many other things. A properly run contract farming agreement is quite a demanding thing to do. And on the whole, it breaks even for the larger units of occupation, not the smaller units of occupation. And what we desperately need, looking at where we are, and we'll look at this in a little more in a moment, is opportunities for the proficient and the new to expand and grow and develop and get hold of the land they need to do right by themselves and right by the agricultural economy and right by the landowner. And this is now the means whereby it's easier to scale up and scale down through the let sector than it is by more illiquid land ownership. So just to illustrate that point, if this wishes to behave, there we are. This is 5 years' worth of AHDB figures for net margin from crops. Standard arable crops. Don't worry too much about the right-hand one, it's linseed. Nobody ever grew linseed except for subsidy in the main. But here you have the green are the top quartile. The brown, who are always going to be an interesting mixture of people with a wide range of motives, are the bottom quartile. But the blue are the middle 50%. That illustrates something of the challenge we face. And the more that we can get people to deliver green performance there, or land into the hands of the green performers, the more we will have done the rural economy a good service, because those are the people with doing the good management, those are the people who will deliver on the environmental management as well as the farm management, the financial management, and be part of the productivity for the future. And this is from the Irish government. We'll come back to them a little later. Access to land and low level of land mobility is one of the major challenges facing farmers who wish to increase productivity. A growing consensus, the actual use of land is becoming more of an issue than ownership. And in this, I want to start, I'm saying absolutely nothing about ownership. I'm very happy for anybody who wants to own land for whatever reasons they've got. I'm interested in its productive use and then the best arrangements for looking at that. And they did some statistical work here showing that actually its age is less relevant. All sorts of people, it's easy to fall into stereotypes at this point. But if we take the argument that an ageing farming population is an issue, if we say that, and I'm not necessarily saying that, it's dwarfed by having land not in the hands of the proficient. Really, we want good farmers on the land where they're going to farm well. So we look a little bit at the lettings market, and it is primarily bare land. The green folder, the green documents you've got on your chairs, those report from our land occupation survey. We've been doing that every year since 1977. That's the report from 22. We're working on the 23 report now. People talk about tenanted farms. Only 7.5% of lettings are of farms that have houses and have buildings. Overwhelmingly, it's bare land here and in Scotland, both often smaller blocks. So understanding what we're looking at is actually core to how we drive policy. We want new access to proficient farmers, access to land without carrying its capital cost, points we've already made, for owners to find value and virtue in letting, and then the productivity benefits of contestable markets. Getting more good people onto land sets a higher standard for everybody else to measure themselves by. There's then more infrastructure for it. You start moving into a virtuous spiral. And I think broadly, to look ahead, the great estates made their minds up about what they want to let and not a generation and a half ago. The opportunities for new land to come into the let sector come from the smaller and medium-sized owners for whom the future looks more challenging than they care for. They still want to retain the family patrimony, they want to have the land, but earn a better income by having somebody else farm it for them. And I think that is where we need to go, and that is the kind of frame we need to understand from where we're heading in looking at lettings policy. This was a nice phrase I picked up the other day. The composer Gustav Mahler said something along the lines of tradition is not worshipping the ashes, but tending the flame. You need to carry forward things that are vital, not just simply preserving things because they were once and now have no life in them. And there's the issue that we've developed some very strong arguments for farming in the 30s, 40s, around the farming ladder, around the very economic policies of the 47-48 Acts, but one strong argument could become a prison. And we ceased to see Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies used as the main vehicle for lettings in the 1980s. The rise of the Gladstone Bower, the 18-month tenancy, allowed by a gap in the law, an exception. The Wise report on county smallholdings in 1966 said the farming ladder wasn't in existence, that county smallholdings were gateways now, not rungs on a ladder. Now, they were recognising that then, 50 years ago. And we need to really make sure our policy thinking is catching up. We're looking for answers in a long-changed world. So we have some very interesting things going on. Just for once in the policy environment, we've got real live tests of what people are doing. We have in the British Isles 4 laboratory experiments in real time that we can broadly compare, all broadly in common English land, all broadly in common land law, because Scots land law is not so different for these purposes. The Irish Republic has our land law, because it goes back that way. And we can look at these come through. We liberalised with farm business census in 1995. That, as you'll see in a moment, stopped the hemorrhage from the let sector and brought new land in. It then fossilised with the single payment proposals coming in. But what we have done in England is, as Holdings Act tenancies have inevitably ended, FBTs have fully replaced the land lost. Some new land, mostly land that was let being relet. Scotland made a restricted and complex reform 9 years later. Letting, and this is from the Agricultural Holdings Law Review Group in 2014, said being a landlord in Scotland is a high-risk, low-reward activity. Yeah, it's not of itself rational, and their new forms of tenancy have not made good the losses. So England still has a let sector around 33-35% of land area. Scotland is down to 20%. We were on the same figure in the mid-90s. So just to give you this chart, this goes back into the early 80s. You see the hemorrhaging of land out of the let sector. This is net movements from our survey. There we are. You will see the hemorrhaging of land out of the let sector up until reform. And then reform bringing land in, combined with the inheritance tax reform. And then you see, and really that flat lining thereafter is 2003, January 2003, the Commission published its single payment proposals. And the sales market dropped dead within 7 days, because land was clearly the key to future payments, and the lettings market stalled over the year. People sorted themselves out, and an awful lot of very complex activity actually went on then, because there were owners who let for 7 years. We had on our survey, we had 207-year lets in that period. We would never see those ordinarily. Just as other landowners took land back in hand in order to get their minuscule 10% of the first bit of the phasing in of historic payments. But after 2006, you just see the dull pulse as people were paid by area payments, explicit and express area payments, to occupy land. So they carried on doing so. We had stasis in the land market. But look elsewhere in the UK, we will do. Northern Ireland, we dismantled the tenancy system back in around the decades either side of 1900 for all sorts of political reasons. 30% of land there is now held on what we would know as grazing licenses. Insecure occupations, the reluctance to invest, concerns about productivity, environmental, disease control and the rest. And there is now positive political interest, and we're working with the Farmers Union there on these issues, to look at new tenancies using the complete freedom of contract in Northern Ireland to be a vehicle for a more productive economy there, looking at the future where, with all the environmental issues, very conscious in Northern Ireland, we are going to have to produce more from less land in order to be able to deliver the food that people need. And that is around a framework looking, as we shall see in a moment, at 5-year tenancies, as being the framework that builds confidence to start a let sector in Northern Ireland from scratch. Because the Irish Republic is further down this road. as the 4th laboratory experiment in the UK. Similar position, it was 30% on Conacre. But in 2015, on 2 months' notice, they introduced an income tax relief on rents from letting. And that has provided their arm's length, so you don't just let to your nephew, and they're for at least 5 years. And they'll give you more relief if you let for longer. But that depends how much land you've got to let. That has created a let sector from a standing start, from scratch, that's now reached 10% of 5-year lettings and more. That, frankly, is more than we've done since '95 in England. That's a very, very interesting laboratory experiment. So morals in this: keep the law simple. Scottish law is formidably complicated, so nobody actually really understands what the law is, so they just get on doing what they've always been doing. But they're terribly fearful of it. 7 different types of tenancy. Focus on the flexibility to handle change. Work to make letting attractive. It's great saying we want to do nice things for tenants, but if you don't have landlords, you don't have tenants. So how do we ensure landowners are not going to volunteer for restrictions? If you want a landlord to let for 10 years, that landowner wants to know that he has not put himself into a noose for 10 years. You know, if terms are as now and I wish to choose to let for 10 years, splendid. But if I think something's going to happen and I am then in an inflexible position, it is perfectly rational for somebody to want to be quite shy about that. But there is this market, I think, of weary owners, now expressly that we've delinked in England, but coming along as we go through, and Wales looks at sustainable farming and the rest, who can let if they come to see it as having value and virtue. And this is where protecting the existing will frustrate the new. And very much here, I just want to look at a number of things where I see a lot of magical thinking, where just saying nice things doesn't mean that nice things will happen, but it may make you very comfortable. We need to look at practical policy making. So let's just deal with one thing I think is a particular threat to us, which is the proposal for limiting APR on let land to land let for at least 8 years. This comes out of work originally done by ROC on looking at encouraging tenants' access to environmental opportunities. The Treasury took it up, put it out in the consultation asking for views. We responded to that. It is, of course, an English debate that now would have, if it's inheritance tax, UK-wide consequences. And so while actually much of the Treasury paper is written in English terms, we have to understand it as it would apply in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland in this on environmental taxation generally. The consultation paper then asked, well, what are the exceptions you might need if you were to do this? And indeed, it was entirely open, said, look, we've heard these arguments for it, but equally we've heard there could be perverse answers. What might those be? And so we put those all in as we went along. So looking at this, would this attract any owner who is not now letting to let? We would see different answers around the UK. And what we were able to do was use the material in that green book you have there to look at the different periods of letting now and take views as to what different owners would do in different circumstances. So the lettings between 5 and 8 years, would they nudge up? What would people do letting between 2 and 5 years? What the very short lettings would do? What would happen with Scottish short limited duration tenancies? And indeed, where would we be in Northern Ireland? And our analysis, and it's on the website and it's open there for people to view, is looking at this, we see very little gain in lettings longer than 8 years. And within that, and Scottish evidence around limited duration tenancies shows this, that if you put a figure in, the market retreats to the lower figure. We saw when LDTs were cut from minimum length of LDTs in Scotland was cut from 15 years to 10, the market dropped to 10 years. There's almost nothing let for longer. Set 8, the 10, 20, 25-year lettings we're getting at the moment would tend to become 8. We would get some of those 5 to 8 year tenancies going north to 8 years. But others would have had their own reasons for not choosing it, and others would be sufficiently disturbed to come shorter. But there are not that many of those tenancies. And then the other shorter lets would, I think, overwhelmingly tend to go short or out. And playing through the models, this is the average of our two models. We reckoned there were 500,000 acres leaving the let sector within 3 or 4 years. And as the Holdings Act tenancies come to an end and are largely not relet, we retreat to the Scottish 20% percentage. The only way you can make this proposal work is if you assume the let sector shrinks to something under 10%, which is not the answer I think anybody wants. This is not a functional answer. It's magical thinking. The tax answer that has worked is, of course, the one I've mentioned, which is the one in Ireland. And this really has revived the let sector from scratch, and I think is a very powerful model for us to look at and explore much more thoroughly as to how it would work within the UK. We have evidence of a comparable country achieving something very notable. So we've got lots of challenges to unwind with farming. The productivity challenge. We've got also new technologies, the environmental trends, and the increasing risks of climate change. Managing risk, I think, is a real challenge for us all. The spread of the weather we have now and hot droughts is something that classic English farm management has not had to meet. And it's more challenging about what we crop, how we crop. And the balance of risk and reward that we deploy and the consciousness of working capital in that, I think all become important questions, probably mostly outside the topic of this paper. But it is interesting looking at this classic graph that comes around, and you can only see so much of it, but very broadly, when McSharry payments came in, English farming productivity improvement fell behind its comparators. And the same is true actually in the Republic. But that's behind France and Germany and Holland. And we are looking at that as something where we had then, in one sense, we can see this as an opportunity. If we get it right, there's a lot of catch-up to be done in that. Area payments, and this is where we come back into this work we've done, is that looking back at that chart of movements in the let sector, the activity in the let sector in every year since 2006 has been between 30 and 40% of what it was in 1999-2000. And the number of FBTs granted is now less than a quarter of what it was in 2000. Just stasis, a dying market losing its pulse. But now, with payments gone, area payments gone, the reward for occupation gone, we can now see what might happen. But we need to make sure that letting's attractive in all of this. If we make letting unattractive, clearly there'll be more contracting. Owners will find environmental options more attractive in themselves if we make letting unattractive to owners. The interesting thing, I think, that comes out of yesterday's policy statements, interestingly, is the increase in payments for SFI and the interest of range in offers for SFI. SFI as the model that sits with being a commercial farmer, those actually may actually buttress the landlord-tenant system by providing income through commercial farming in interesting ways. But owners and farmers would otherwise, back as in the late 70s, early 80s and so on, find other ways of trying to come to deals, which on the whole are easier for larger people, larger farmers, established farmers to take up than the small and the new. So opening these markets is clearly where we want to go, and we need to encourage people to do it. Steps on the way in all of this. We understand the variety of FBTs. There's too much simple description of all FBTs are 3 years. Well, no, they're not. FBTs let for at least a year are let on average for 5 years. FBTs that are for larger areas are let for much longer. FBTs that include a house and buildings are let for longer. FBTs that replace a Holdings Act tenancy are let for longer. What we do have also is that a quarter of cases, we know because we've been surveying this and it's in the Green publication, a quarter of cases it is a choice between the parties suiting their own circumstances is the term that's been let. And in most other cases, it's just what they've been doing before. So Scotland is looking very interesting. Having been a world of opaque complexity and watching the tenanted sector in retreat, we hope that the land reform bill due this winter is going to come forward with the land use tenancy as a near freedom of contract framework for new people to arrive at new agreements to deliver farming, environment, climate change and other measures. A basic framework of law in order to give new opportunities for people. If the Scottish Government is able to enact this, this is looking very promising as a new avenue, much needed in Scotland. So when we come back, we have two parties. They're in a business deal. We hope they're in good relationships, particularly when they're striking the deal. What drives the agreement? What's it for? What's their objectives? What's the relationships? How do they give mutual benefit to each other? And thinking these through and hoping each has reasonable expectations and understanding and transparency of what's going on. What happens at the end of the agreement? If you're in more complex agreements, how losses are handled. All, I think, quite key to try and look at. So it's pragmatic, reasonable, fair action between parties, looking at lengths, looking at agreements, well-advised, good behaviour, and all this applies to contract farming as much as tenancies. It's the contract farmer who frequently offers over-optimistically on first charge as much as does the tenant, the would-be tenant in these things. We need to be sensible and level-headed in looking at the world we're coming to. I thought we would just close, and look, before there's still time for some questions, just look at some other wider interventions that are going on. Land reform in Scotland, very much discouraging anybody who is a larger landholding, interested community involvement in management and so forth. Some discussion indeed of even adopting the French model of having statutory review of land transactions, and that we look at that. But that is a process of discussion. Compulsory purchase. That was Scotland. There we are, compulsory purchase. This, I think, we have to be prepared. The phrase that's in play is we're looking at a tripling of compulsory purchase in the world we're now in, for housing, for infrastructure and the other things. And as HS2 seriously demonstrates, this is a massive issue for farms. Because if you lose your house to a motorway, you lose everything. You're clean out. If you're a farm, broadly these things take a strip out of the middle of you. They leave land the wrong side. You're dealing with contractors. You're living with the prospect of the project. You're living with the project. And then you're living with it afterwards. And this is a much longer relationship, a much more traumatic relationship for everybody involved. And officially, compulsory purchase is the last resort after good negotiation. And indeed, we've seen 2 major orders struck down recently for bad practice in that. But all too often, and HS2 is too often the area of this, it gets more unfortunate than that. And of course, so many people who are acting in compulsory purchase have never felt what it's like to be on the receiving end. It's a very interesting thing asking an audience of them how many have done it. You might get 2 out of 100. Now, we've had since 1959 very clearly market value compensation. Now, you can argue that you're not a willing seller. No, this is the argument for it being a bit more than that. But leave that be, we've had market, and that includes any hope value that the land might have. There is now a lot of pressure to exclude hope value, and the new Levelling Up Act actually begins to breach this dike, so that if a public sector body is trying to buy land for housing, for affordable housing, for schools, for hospitals, then it can exclude hope value if the Secretary of State approves. And I think this is opening the door to where we might go, particularly in the change of government, where you might see existing use value or existing use value plus, perhaps more, 5 times agricultural land, whatever, but a cap on what you can be paid when your land is forcibly taken by power of law. And I think that, again, is something we want to watch as we look at this balancing, the acceleration of infrastructure and everything else coming through as we deal with this. So we're revisiting a problem here. And again, old mistakes. The 47 planning legislation, which brought in some of this compulsory purchase as we now know it, did so on a very sketchy basis. 1947 was an incredibly depressed year. It really was the nadir of the post-war world, bad weather, dull economy, strikes, Parliament meeting by candlelight and the rest. And then we began to have recovery in the 1950s and development was happening. And what we found was that as the way it was set up, councils found they were buying at existing use value. As we discovered hope values, we discovered how planning limited where value was. And developers said, well, hold on, I don't think I can buy your nice field because the council can come along and then compulsorily purchase it from me at existing use value. So developers were holding back, saying, we need to have planning permission before we will buy from you. And that was why the law was changed to make it very, very clear it was indeed market value in 1959, consolidated in the 61 Act. And I fear we risk repeating a mistake just when we need the ability to develop, because land is actually typically a very small share of the overall cost of many of these projects, whatever people might say. So we've got all these issues coming through, and I think that one, of course, we've got the wonderful prospect of the Keir Starmer bulldozer actually achieving something on housing. But we come to rights over land, statutory powers to take rights, electricity and the rest. But we are looking at the re-electrification of Britain. We are looking also at water companies needing to sort their sewage plants out and their reed beds and the water pipes coming down to get water to the southeast and all the other things to deal with, all the water issues you've all heard about, massive capital programmes. But here we are, 400,000 miles of new or upgraded cable. That's across virtually every farmer in Britain. And again, payment provisions and how we deal with it and how we deal with utilities and how we deal with contractors, how we enforce liabilities and so on in all of this then become continuing issues. And the awful warning here is where we've been with the Electronic Communications Code since late 17. In order to give people connectivity, they took the easy answer. Give strong powers, cut payments, and you discover you produce resistance. The old code had, I think, no more than 3 or 4 cases in its 25, 30 years. We've had over 400 tribunal cases and 3 Supreme Court cases in the last 6 years. Choose. Disputes, and this is where we are moving. The government's looking hopeful. We are moving on a number of fronts to look at alternative dispute resolution being provided for, encouraged for the code, provided for electricity lines, working on that now to come through as a means so you don't have to go to tribunal in order to get justice. Because tribunal is beyond most of these claims. And we will offer here a dispute, as you will see from the white paper on your chairs, again, a dispute resolution service to try to handle all of that. So morals in all of this. Actually, good behaviour achieves results for everybody. Strong powers lead to resistance. Paying fairly is part of fair treatment. And indeed, improving dispute resolution improves behaviour. The strongest powers in compulsory purchase are the powers worst used. And I think these are morals that we are having to make repeatedly to government in this. And again, it's part of looking at basic property rights in land and where we go. So, if we go through to the final overview, we are in a more regulated age. We are looking at crossroads on all these fronts. There is the choice of protection and flexibility. There is a bias in public opinion to want comfort, to not to be disturbed, when we need to look at improving productivity and future competitiveness, if we are to deliver the public services and living standards that we think we're entitled to. Markets, regulation, and environmental control, we're going to have to find the right balance between all of these, but we should have the honesty and clarity of thinking not to repeat past mistakes. We should learn from our bruises and get things better. We've got this future to make. So, there were some thoughts. I hope it's been interesting. I hope you've seen where we as an association are involved in looking at much of this. I'm very pleased to see that nobody actually left during it. I'm very happy to take questions or indeed move on, as it might say there, to discussion in such time as is left before the bell rings and you're summoned somewhere else. But I think we are in very challenging times in a fascinating decade, and we need to think clearly about how we help clients best through this. Sorry, we're getting you a microphone because it helps the recording.
Thank you very much. 2 questions. The first a little bit more kind of political for this time of the morning. And that is that you, no more than anybody, would know the power of language. And I, here in the audience, having written about this extensively in the Farmers Weekly and elsewhere, about the power of gendered language in particular, you, I'm sure, will accept that women can own land and pass it on to their sons and nieces and nephews. And just reflecting on the content of your talk, which was highly gendered. A, I would like you to apologise. B, I would like you to sign up to the Level the Field campaign, which the Farmers Weekly is now running, with the CAAV on behalf of all of the agricultural professionals. Recognise this campaign?
Well, when I find out more about this campaign, I shall discuss with the chairman of the executive exactly whether we should do that, who is here listening to you.
Andrew Meredith is over there. I'm sure he will have a chat with you.
Yes, I'm sure he will.
The second question, which is less political, but more interesting probably, is about carbon. You haven't really mentioned carbon rights in land, and this is a question I get asked again and again and again, particularly in a landlord and tenant context.
Right.
What's your thinking, please?
Yeah, I partly to keep things within any recognisable timescale, and also the fact I covered carbon rather more thoroughly in these remarks last year. My thoughts on carbon, frankly, are that there are paradoxes about carbon. It is very, very important. Nothing I'm going to say is going to take anything away from the absolute salience of decarbonising the economy. But at farm level, carbon is a very low economic value. Carbon risks being a displacement activity, a distraction in all of this for some things that people are talking about, not for all, but quite often. I see, if I had to summarise where I am on this, it is that we overestimate what we can do for others and underestimate what we should do for ourselves. I think farmers should audit carbon. I think farmers should then hoard their carbon. I think they should see it as an investment in their farm and their land and their business. I'm talking about commercial farmers here. Other landowners may have other objectives. They should not see it as an output. They should not see it as something to alienate. They should be very wary of the liabilities they incur in doing all of this. Very strictly, a strict carbon sequestration policy is a 100-year commitment. And I think the evidence is beginning to accumulate how we have monumentally underrated the risks in all of this. There's a very good quasi-actuarial study of the offsetting scheme in California, which shows that in the first 7 years of a 100-year commitment, they'd already burnt the entire buffer for 100 years with wildfires. And the world we're moving into on that front. The costs of monitoring, verification, reporting, and so on over time, I think, are much more onerous than people think. And if Storm Arwen comes and destroys all your trees, you still have the liability to insure the carbon if you've entered into a commitment to provide it to other people on whatever timescale you've entered into. So I think for people who are looking at deals, there is a very serious risk of seller's remorse. So I think this is back to the supply chain will be one of the most powerful drivers in pressing for carbon, more than public policy and other things, and that I'm going to suggest that you do not alienate the easy, low-hanging fruit when you will desperately need them for your own interests in time, and it will become to be part of what lenders and others expect from you as a farmer to be able to show, and having given it away for low value and possibly large liability is probably a foolish thing to do. In landlord-tenant, I'm really rather wary of quite a lot of things that people appear to have been talking around earlier on. And again, I think it's because, as we said in the reply to the Treasury on taxation environmental assets, I think there's a lot of very poor analysis of what people are actually engaged in doing. I think the risk is, if a landlord tries to control all carbon, well, farming is the business of managing carbon. I think there's a level of short-sightedness in this. And I'm going to look back at this as being the farming business needing to look after its carbon as part of underpinning itself. If the supply chain reaches the point where it says we want 5 acres of woodland from you, then I think tenant and landlord have got to look together about where that's most sensibly done. And if it goes in a place that's not too damaging to the tenant and is really rather good for the landlord's shooting, to use the stereotypes you might resist from me, then I would think that's a sensible chatter for people to have. But these are pragmatics. But I'd rather, there is a mitigation hierarchy, I suppose, and I'm conscious of a hand at the back. There is a mitigation hierarchy. Offsetting is the lowest form, the final form, the end of where you get to if you can't solve your own problems in-house or not have them in the first place. And I think there's too much easy chatter of markets that may actually... There may be some poison chalices in this that people will come to regret. The concept of seller's remorse. And one of the ways I illustrate that, the enormous explosion in solar farms that started in spring 2010, when we all suddenly learnt about solar farms, and they started down in Cornwall on the back of feed-in tariffs. And somewhere out there, there is doubtless somebody who came home terribly proud to have signed a deal to let land for £200 an acre for a solar farm use. And I suspect his family permanently remind him of it because he will still be bound by that commitment. That definitely would have been a bloke. That is very gendered. Sorry, there was a hand at the back.
It actually sort of follows on from that question.
Good.
So I've heard from a variety of farmers across different areas that some of the structural changes they might try to make around biodiversity or shifting to kind of more regenerative measures actually undermine the land's value in the current land valuation system. Do you foresee any shifts in how land is valued, kind of reflecting some of the changes that we see coming down the line from policy or more broadly?
It's always very dangerous for me to foresee anything very much around those areas. It would depend entirely on the play of supply and demand and appetites in the market. There are clearly pools of people who want to buy land with environmental attributes or for environmental purposes. And indeed, there are, and if we look at the Glendy deal in Scotland with Aviva, there are companies that see this as a small part of their advertising budget as means to show that they're doing nice things. But the risk is the risk that a lot of people fear with biodiversity, for example, BNG, is does this risk somewhere there being a statutory designation arising from it? I think a lot of that will depend on what actually is the land use you put it to. And I think there's a level of, there may be a level of over-expectation of how much land use might change with biodiversity net gain. A lot of it will just be farming with more environmental attributes. So, this is the great answer, it's too early to tell. But it will change who may be the bidders. It could change who may be the bidders for some land. And, of course, it might prompt some people to be sellers. So the markets move on. I suspect, looking at the absence of half the audience, I should release you all to go and get another cup of coffee and find your way. But I hope this has been interesting. I hope this has been useful. And I hope you've seen our part in all of this, in trying to look as clear-sightedly as we can and pose the questions we can about where we might actually be going. Thank you.